Welcome to the second session of Climate Change Demands We Change. Why aren't we? My name is Brian McGrath. I'm the Dean of the School of Constructed Environments here at Parsons, the New School for Design. The School of Constructed Environments, architecture, interior design, lighting design, product design, we play an important role at a university that puts design and social change at the center of its agenda. And so it's appropriate that the dean of that school should transition us from the psychological to the physical city. It's with great pleasure that I welcome you all here for this wonderful afternoon. And I'm going to jump right into an introduction of our first speaker. Guy Nordenson is a structural engineer and professor of architecture and structural engineering at Princeton University. And I believe I first met Guy when he and Terry Riley co-curated the Tall Buildings exhibition that MoMA held when it was out in Queens in 2004. But I think he brings great knowledge and expertise to this panel because of his incredibly important research project funded by the Latrobe Research Prize on the water Palisades Bay. It was published in 2010 by Hache Kans and served as an inspiration for the influential 2010 MoMA workshop and exhibition, Rising Currents, in a way that kind of prepped a generation of designers, landscape designers, architects, urban designers for Sandy, I believe. His book, Seven Structural Engineers, was published in 2008 by MoMA, and his collection of essays, Patterns in Structure, was published in 2010 by Lars Müller. In 2009, Nordenson was the 7th practicing structural engineer to be awarded the AIA's Institution Honors for Collaborative Achievement Award and was the first to be elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He is Commissioner and Secretary of the New York City Public Design Commission. He has been engaged in climate adaptation and flood hazards mitigation research and has been active in improving the resilience of New York City as a member of numerous committees and task forces. He was appointed by Governor Cuomo to the New York State Commission in 2001 to 2100 Commission and by Mayor Bloomberg to the New York City Panel on Climate Change. So I really welcome the citizen engineer, Guy Nordenson.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here. My first teaching job was here at the New School a little over 30 years ago. And that first day teaching, I couldn't get a word out. I just stood there in front of the class, completely mute, until I finally gave up and walked out. And the next week, the man I was working for at the time, Mario Salvadori, who was teaching at Columbia, a very kind, talented structural engineer, he said I couldn't quit. And so he organized for Felix Candela to come and teach in my place, and I could watch how it was done. And he also organized a graduate student to come and help me out. And so they both held me from each side, and I managed somehow to make it through that first year. It was a great period to teach here, and I've always had a great fondness for this institution. I am going to talk about a project that actually I'm working on together with Michael Oppenheimer and other colleagues at Princeton, which is the continuation of the work that Brian mentioned. We call it Structures of Coastal Resilience, and it's part of a suite of initiatives that have been undertaken by the Rockefeller Foundation, including the Rebuild by Design initiative led by Henk Ovink, which has just gone through the judging of the 10 remarkable schemes for coastal resilience up and down the coast, and the 100 Resilient Cities project, which Rockefeller is also sponsoring for worldwide resilience. So this is one aspect of a very important initiative by Rockefeller. This project is focused on the work that is being done by the Army Corps of Engineers this year as a result of Sandy to develop a comprehensive plan for the North Atlantic region. Congress asked the Army Corps to come back in January of 2015 with a plan for making this part of the coast more resilient, the part of the coast affected by Sandy. The color coding from purple to green shows the zones that were more affected or somewhat affected by the hurricane. And what's fascinating about this initiative is that for the first time, the Army Corps is being asked to provide risk reduction strategies. And it's a subtle point, but an important one, that it's all about finding strategies that encompass many different types of features which together improve the, reduce the risk to coastal communities from flooding. And a big part of this is the use of sustainable and robust coastal landscape systems, as well as the consideration of sea level rise and climate change. So this is a federal program led by the Army Corps of Engineers that is taking into account the contribution of nature and the effects of climate change. So it's a big step and a very important one for the government and for the Army Corps. As part of that, the Army Corps has gone back and looked at all of what they call features that contribute to coastal resilience and categorized them, some as structural features, which as an engineer are the ones that come naturally to the Army Corps and come historically have been the main focus of the Army Corps. Levees, groins, breakwaters, things like that, things that are physical interventions, structures in the stream, so to speak, that provide degrees of protection, but also nature-based features, as they're called, which are wetlands and other features which contribute to resilience on a day-to-day basis, reducing the wave effects and erosion that are caused by wave, but also in the event of storms as part of a layered system of protection. And then finally, non-structural, what they call non-structural features, which are things like building codes, planning regulations, or even elevation of houses to get out of the flood zone. An important part of this series of strategies that the Army Corps is looking at is this notion of layered protection, that it's not simply a matter of building one wall that will take care of everything, but it's a matter of building a series of interventions, some natural, some engineered, depending on the circumstances, which all together work to protect communities. So you might elevate houses, build a levee that will protect you up to a certain level, and then build some offshore features that will help break waves, diminish storm surge, and so on. So already the Army Corps has incorporated many of the ideas that we've all been talking about for the last 5 or 10 years in this area, the notion of soft infrastructure, et cetera. In order to try to contribute to this comp study, as it's being called, we proposed and have been supported by Rockefeller to do a series of 4 different design studies led by 4 institutions. Harvard is working on it through the Graduate School of Design, led by Michael Van Valkenburg. Catherine Sievert is leading a team at City College here in New York, looking at Jamaica Bay. Harvard team is looking at Narragansett Bay. Paul Lewis at Princeton is leading a team looking at the area around Atlantic City. And Anu Mathur and Dilip Kunha at University of Pennsylvania are working together on a project for Norfolk, Virginia, and Hampton area. So capturing 4 very distinct and different places up and down the North Atlantic coast, which is the region of interest to the Army Corps, and 4 different institutions, 3 of which led by the Landscape Architecture Department of those institutions, working on these 3 locations. That's one part of the study, and I'll show you some of the results of that shortly. Another part of the study, which we're doing at Princeton, which I felt was a very important part of this initiative, is to step back and look to see if we can't find improved ways of approaching the assessment of the hazard of storm surge and the way that hazard changes with climate change. And this is where Michael and his team and others at Princeton are very much involved. Current flood maps, and the current insurance program that is based on those flood maps, led by FEMA, has a number of limitations. An important one is that for the moment, it doesn't take into account climate change effects. So there's no way to consider the effect of sea level rise or other aspects, changes that are happening as a result of the climate change. There's also been a lot of attention and concern about the specificity of the flood maps and the degree to which they give the impression of a level of certainty and knowledge which in fact they don't embody. So there's a lot built into the development of the maps, both in terms of assumptions about topography, assumptions about the kind of hurricanes that affect the development of the maps, and so on and so forth, which have uncertainties built into them, but those uncertainties are not visible. And so the users of those maps can't understand and respond to the fact that maybe if there's a line on the map, that line doesn't actually assure them that they're going to be safe if they're on the other side. One of my colleagues at Princeton is just completing a study showing that in Sandy, for instance, many of the zones that were considered safe were the most badly damaged. Many of the zones that were considered highly unsafe were least damaged. So it's, and this is typical of natural hazards. We can't pinpoint what is out of danger and what is in danger. We can only try to describe ranges, and the maps don't do that very well. There's also the question of residual risk, and that's a term that applies to the possibility that if you're behind a flood control structure, say a berm or levee in New Orleans, you can't assume it might not fail. And so what happens in that case, if there's a failure, as there was in Katrina, and a district is flooded, there's no provision in any of the codes or insurance programs to deal with that as well. So in trying to deal with this, we've looked at a number of different strategies that we have tried to incorporate within the schemes that we've developed. One has to do with means of attenuating the effect of waves, so things out on the water or in the water that improve the resilience of communities and flood protection by cutting the problem out at the source, if you like, reducing storm surge, reducing wave effects. The protection that's provided by engineered structures, levees that up to a point will keep the water out, and finally planning that elevates houses or in general tries to deal with the problem of relocation in an intelligent way. One of the analogies that I use for myself in trying to deal with this issue, this problem or set of problems, and Ray Zimmerman, who's in the room, will appreciate this, is that approach that has been used very effectively to deal with earthquake hazard. We have a program in the US started in the 1970s called the National Earthquake Hazard Reduction Program, and it's been a very well organized and very effective way of bringing all the different agencies together and giving each agency a specific area of responsibility and a steady stream of funding. And we've been very successful in this country in reducing the damage due to earthquakes because of that, the success of that program. Anyway, I am trying to convince people that what we need in the flood area is a similar program for a national organized way of thinking how we invest the rather large resources that we put into this area, perhaps in a more effective way. And I think we have good models for how to do that in the National Earthquake Hazard Reduction Program. So let me go quickly through the science side of this project and give you some idea of what we're trying to do, which we think is innovative. The three different aspects to this that we're working on with different groups in our science group. The first is looking at climate change and sea level rise on a regional basis. And this is the work that Michael's team has been leading. If you look at the sea level rise in different places, even across the North Atlantic seaboard, it's affected by not just the sea level rise, which itself varies to some degree around the globe, but also by the subsidence of the ground. So there are specific differences between the different locations. Those have to do with the different contributions to sea level rise. So again, there's melting ice I'm sure Michael will talk about this later. There is subsidence of the underlying ground, which is an important factor in the North Atlantic, and there are differences in the sea level rise itself in different places. So what we want to do is map that effect as best we can for those different locations. So we're looking at, Chris Little, postdoc working with Michael, has been looking at what those differences are in the different locations that we're studying. And it's not a big number, but it's a significant enough difference that we want to take into account. And it's also pointing to a methodology that we think needs to be part of assessments like this in the future. The second part, which is being led by Ning Lin at Princeton, is the way in which we're modeling the hurricanes. And currently, the best practice for modeling hurricanes is to take the historical record and then to use the track, and this is about 50 or so hurricanes for the North Atlantic region. Take that historical record and modify it slightly, moving the tracks sort of to the east and the west, or the north and the south, changing some of the parameters, and trying to generate a more statistically meaningful set of hurricanes by virtue of the existing information that we have. That's the way that FEMA operates. That's the way many of the assessments that are currently being made are done. What we're trying to use is a methodology that's been developed over the last couple of years by Carrie Emanuel at MIT, Ning Lin, Michael, and others, which is to use global circulation models, which are being used for the estimation of changes in the climate by IPCC and other groups, use those models of the planet as the basis to generate a large number of synthetic hurricanes. The value of that is that you have physically meaningful hurricanes that are generated through that process, and we can get many more hurricanes for our region and then develop different storm surge assessments associated with different return periods for our region, spatially distributed and so on, which is, all this is the same as is currently done with the historic hurricanes, but because we have a larger set, we get a little bit more, information. Anyway, I'll go through this quickly. The point here is that you can get the same model to tell you what your understanding of the current situation is, to have a look at what the future might hold as well. And it's basically an apples and apples comparison, because you're using the same methodology for today as you would use for the future, capturing some of the changes in the hurricanes as well as the effect of sea level rise. Finally, I'll go through this quickly. We map the results of these analyses, and they tell us that there's no hard boundary, that we really need to accept that there are certain floodplains within which we need to study ways of improving resilience. So how do we improve resilience? In the north, in the Narragansett Bay, the Harvard team is looking at a system of locations from both the mouth of the bay to the back of the bay. So looking at how there's this relationship between locations like Newport and the back bay areas like Warren, doing storm surge models of those, and then in particular looking at some of the nodes there where the water kind of rushes through and past up to the northern part of the bay, and in some cases may overwhelm some infrastructure, and finding ways to improve the contribution of vegetation, in this case forests, to storm surge protection, and in particular think about how those plant species and systems can of themselves be more resilient and adaptable to frequent storm surges, and whether large forests, for example, could be developed and nurtured and built there to contribute to that. The next team at Jamaica Bay is really trying to develop a framework for Jamaica Bay. There are quite a number of initiatives right now at Jamaica Bay, and so what they're looking at is all the different themes, if you will, that affect Jamaica Bay. There's the problem of sediment and how that sediment currently it's not available because everything is paved over, but is necessary to maintain the wetlands, how one might be able to reconfigure the system of the bay in order to improve the collection and distribution of sediment, studies on how the bathymetry might evolve in ways that could be beneficial, looking back historically at some of the strategies that the Army Corps has used before, including the possibility of new inlets or new connections between the ocean and the bay that would help both with water quality and also with sediment flow as well. Looking at social vulnerability and understanding how that has an effect both on the development of the facilities that we might put in, but also on the interaction. You know, you make things too attractive, you gentrify a neighborhood, and so how do you balance the protection, and not just physical protection, but the protection of the quality of the neighborhoods as well, and I think that's an important part. So it's social vulnerability alongside environmental vulnerability. So basically the scheme there includes the blue lines. There is some new ways of getting water in and out, and forms of protection, including the development of new wetlands, which could be done through a variety of systems that have been studied. At Atlantic City, we're looking at ways of combining different systems and features that the Army Corps is already working with. So how do you bring groins and wetlands together into new kinds of hybrid features? And so Paul Lewis at Princeton has been studying these ways of combining them, as well as looking at the transition of a community over time with sea level rise and increased storms. So how do you take an existing community that's already starting to change, people moving out, not that many moving back in, and reconfigure that gradually over a long period of time to raise some of the houses, raise some of the landscape, maybe raise some of the roads, introduce canals, and gently, if you will, transform that place into a different kind of place that is more resilient through a series of very specific planned steps. So these are two communities on the backside, on the back bay of Atlantic City. Army Corps has been very interested in the ocean front. We're trying to draw attention now also to the back bay, which is equally vulnerable. Finally, in Norfolk, which is a very low-lying city, the team from Penn has been looking at the morphology of the area around there and developing what they call fingers of high ground, which is a very interesting idea of taking a levee and turning it around and seeing what happens when you start to think of high ground bands that might be introduced into a community that can serve as a way, as a refuge, but also as part of a system of protection. So rather than walling off Norfolk into a series of compartments that would be protected, their idea is to introduce these fingers of high ground as a transformation of the landscape, really sort of raising parts of the city and potentially even linking them up in ways with temporary barriers. It's quite a radical idea, and it took me a while to wrap my head around it, but the community in Norfolk really likes it. I'm almost done. So these are some examples in Willoughby Spit. There you go. Thank you very much.
Next, I'd like to introduce Tugis Wright and his collaborator at Princeton, Michael Oppenheimer. Michael is the Albert Milbank Professor of Geosciences and International Affairs at the Woodrow Wilson School in the Department of Geosciences at Princeton University. He is the director of the program in Science, Technology, and Environmental Policy at the Woodrow Wilson School, and faculty associate in the Atmospheric and Ocean Sciences program, Princeton Environmental Institute, and the Princeton Institute for International Regional Studies. Oppenheimer joined the Princeton faculty after more than 2 decades with the Environmental Defense Fund, a non-governmental environmental organization where he served as chief scientist and manager of the Climate and Air program. He continues to serve as a science advisor to the Environmental Defense Fund, and he's a longtime participant in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. Serving recently as the lead author of the IPCC's 4th assessment report, and now as a coordinating lead author of the 5th assessment report, as well as a special report on climate extremes and disasters. Oppenheimer has been a member of several panels of the National Academy of Sciences and is now a member of the National Academy's Board on Energy and Environmental Studies. He's also a winner of the 2010 Heinz Award and a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you for being here. If you were here this morning, I was not, but I imagine by looking through the talks and knowing some of the people who presented, that you, among the many interesting messages you heard might have been one, which is that it's not wise to scare people and to talk too much about disaster, because disaster is paralyzing and you have to give people a way out of a bad situation. So I want you to understand, because I'm going to present some discouraging PowerPoints, that, I mean, my own personal belief is this is a problem that can be solved. It can be solved through a combination of reducing the emissions that are causing the climate problem and therefore the sea level rise and therefore the increased risk around the city. But there are certain obstacles to doing so, not just on the emissions reduction side, but on the side which we're really focused on today, which is the issue of building resilience and protecting ourselves from this increasing risk. We live in a society where thinking over the long term is not necessarily what people are used to doing, or at least government officials, even the ones that are supposed to, and that due to certain political exigencies, it's much easier to do certain things which have traction in the short term but don't help or are counterproductive for the long term. So just keep that in mind. I think this can be solved, but it requires a different way of thinking, because as opposed to most other problems that our decision makers face, as opposed to, for instance, the earthquake risk that Guy talked about, this is a risk that's dynamic because the climate is going to be changing continuously in somewhat unpredictable ways, and because the sea level will be rising, because the storm intensities may be changing, we're facing a problem which is dynamic in the way that most other problems that our decision makers have to deal with is not. And this is what I worry about, basically. Take a second to look at the cartoon. This is what's called risk management. You perceive a hazard, you talk about it, that's risk assessment, and you wind up talking about it so long that you do nothing and you have to run for your lives. We don't want to get into that situation, is the bottom line. So what's happening with the climate, and why does it matter for the world? Why does it matter for New York City? Very quickly, Earth has been warming. The upper panel is the temperature, the global mean temperature over the last 150 years, a period over which we have good thermometer measurements. The panel under it is the decadal average. You can see the last decade on the right is where we are today, and that's warmer than any other decade previously. And the third panel is a geographic pattern of how the warming looks. Basically, red is warm. And there's only one spot on Earth which is blue, or a little, where there's been some cooling. We think we understand that. It has to do with the ocean circulation. But overall, Earth is warmed significantly over the last 100 years or so, about almost 9/10 of a degree Celsius, more than 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit. And that is very significant in the historical context. And it's just the beginning of a larger warming, which we can only bring under control by reducing the emissions of the greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, which are causing the problem and which result mostly from the combustion of fossil fuel, which unfortunately is used to power our society, so it's not easy to just step out of it. You have to think about it and gradually reduce these emissions over a multi-decadal period. One of the consequences of the warming is that the sea level has been rising. That happens, as Guy mentioned. Of course, ice on land melts and goes in the ocean, because water in the ocean expands, and because when fluids are heated, they generally expand, and because not only the mountain glaciers are melting, but the major ice sheets on Greenland and Antarctica are disintegrating gradually as well, so that the upper panel shows the way sea level has changed over the past century or so. Oh no, I'm sorry, the lower panel, the red curve, is the long term. Since about 1900, the data is more or less reliable. The recent data is the black part at the very right-hand side of the red curve. That's an overlapping curve of direct satellite measurements of sea level. And you notice that that's increasing at actually a slightly accelerated rate compared to the old way of measuring it with what are called tide gauges. And finally, at the top, we blow up the black portion, and you can see the rate of sea level rise, which from Guy's presentation also, you'll note is now about 3 millimeters per year. That's higher than it was over most of the past century, when it was more like 2 millimeters per year. Sea level has risen about 8 inches global average in the last century, about 12 inches in New York City and vicinity, for reasons I'll explain later. That may not sound like a lot, but if you raise sea level by a foot vertically, it takes away through submergence and erosion about 100 feet on a typical East Coast beach. So this is quite a lot of land loss. People who live near the coast or have memory or where there are records for 100 years, it's quite clear that that land loss has happened in places where the beaches are not being either protected through jetties or restored, and restoration is expensive. Jetties take away sand from somewhere else, so it's, over the long term, it's kind of a losing proposition. So the upper panel is temperature, the lower panel is precipitation, lower two. The upper right, the vertical left-hand column, the two on the left, are a low emissions world. This is what happens if we get greenhouse gases under control and we're actually able to slow the warming by slowing emissions. The two on the right are a world that happens if we just keep doing what we're doing, emissions keep increasing at a pretty good clip. And you'll notice that the world where we have on the left, where you have the emissions under control to some extent, you get the whole world warming anyway, but it's a moderate warming. It's probably manageable. I could list a bunch of things that are going to go bad even in that world, but with a modest amount of effort at defending ourselves, except in some places where it's harder for various reasons, like the poor parts of the world. This is a world that we could live in and possibly thrive in. You notice the changes in precipitation, in particular, are rather modest. On the right-hand side, though, you notice the whole world turning rather red. You'll notice big areas of brown, which is drying, reductions in precipitation on the lower right-hand side. And that's a world that most of my colleagues and I also believe would be disastrous for various reasons, where the warming would be so quick, the sea level rise would be so quick that our ability to adapt to it would be not able to catch up. And here's one of the reasons. This is the rate of sea level rise projected under those scenarios. Forget the bars on the right, just look at the curves in the purple and orange. There's a range of uncertainty there. But it basically, the low emissions world is the purple, the high emissions world is the orange, and when you get to the year 2100 on the right, you can get a sea level rise global mean as high as about 1 meter, 3 feet. And that's, I would say today, very hard for us to deal with, even in the rich countries. So when we talk about the future, we want to see what's the risk, what are the probabilities, what are the potential damages, what are the harms. And there are 3 ways to deal with the harms. Number one, the dark circle on the dark oval on the left is the physical part, weather and climate events. We can reduce the likelihood of the damaging nature of those events by reducing the emissions. That's what I showed on the slide before. Number 2 is vulnerability. Vulnerability means not being resilient, being in a bad position if something bad happens. For instance, if you're old and you get excess heat, if you have respiratory problems and there's excess heat, if your house is by the coast and not up on stilts, that all means being vulnerable. Exposure means being at the wrong place at the wrong time, i.e. you shouldn't have built the house on the beach to begin with. So those are the 3 factors, and we can reduce all of them. We can reduce emissions, we can smartly manage coastal development to both reduce exposure, take people out of the wrong place, and we can decrease vulnerability by increasing the resilience of what we do and what we build, and this is a bit of what Guy was talking about. Now, this you're never going to be able to understand in detail, so don't worry about the details. All you have to know is, what this shows is, the top panel shows if we have a half meter of sea, well, let me step back a little bit. If sea level rises and you get a storm coming along, that storm will push the sea into places it's never been before, so that a flood that would have happened under today's sea level once every 100 years might happen every 50 years, as the sea level rises farther, every 5 years, and further every year in a given location, because the sea started higher, so it could go further inland. That's what this graph shows. It shows you what the multiplication factor for how much the risk goes up at any particular location. The top panel shows what the multiplication factor is for a half meter of sea level rise. The bottom panel shows you what happens at particular locations if you take into account the factor that Guy mentioned, that sea level rise is going to be higher at some places than the global average and less at others. If you look at New York City there, you'll see, unfortunately, we're stuck in a part of the world where sea level is going to rise faster than the global average, so that our multiplication factor, which is around 30 to 50 in the top graph, if you assume we get the global average, is actually, when you take the local effects into account, it's more like a factor of 100. So that means a storm that used to come around once a century, now, under the current situation, by the end of this century, under this particular amount of sea level rise, which is sort of in the middle of what we expect, will about be a yearly occurrence. That's how big the multiplication factor is due to sea level rise. Let me repeat that. A storm that was a once-a-century storm comes every year or two in this simulation in the future. A storm like Sandy, which the flood level was, in my reckoning, there's a wide range of uncertainty about it, something like a 1,000-year storm starts to happen every 10 years. You watch 10 years from now, or 8 years from now, and see how well our recovery from Sandy has been, and then ask how difficult it would be if a storm like that happened within every decade. So with this, I'm going to skip in the interest of time. So I'm going to go right to the local problem now. So this is, I think he showed something like that. This is the flood level that occurred with Sandy. It's, again, by certain measures, it was a 1,000-year flood or so. The flood level at the battery was something around 11.5 feet, 3.7 meters. But the thing to understand is it wasn't the worst that could have happened under the current climate. We did, through the calculations with Ning Lin and other colleagues that Guy showed you, we can see through this graph that the storm surge, this doesn't even include the fact that it hit at high tide, just the worst case storm surge we see from current storms is about 4 meters. So just 12 feet, and if you add a couple of feet on for the tide, because the storm struck at high tide, we could have had 2.5 or 3 extra feet of flooding in the city. That would have flooded an immensely greater region of the city. So remember, Sandy was not the worst we could have to deal with. And what we're going to have, this is a plot out of the table out of the New York City Climate Change Panel report that Guy and I both worked on. And if you look at the lower set of rows, it gives you sea level rise for the future. And you notice by the 2020s, we're talking about a sea level rise of about, depending on, 4 to 8 inches. And by the 2050s, in the median case, about a foot, 1 to 2 feet. But in the high case, the 10% chance that the sea level rise is actually 2.5 feet. And that's immense. And just to give you one idea of what it does, this is a figure out of the SIRR report, the Special Initiative under Bloomberg. And it shows you the 10 highest flood levels due to coastal storms in the city in the last 65 years. And the dashed line up near the top is 10.5 feet. That's how high it has to get to flood the New York City subway system. And you notice that with the exception of Sandy, which was the first storm to flood the system, that all the other storms came within about a foot or two of flooding the system. So the sea level rise we get by 2050 matters a lot. It's the difference between a flooded subway system and a not flooded subway system. And you might remember we were very lucky this time. Through diligent efforts by the MTA staff and some luck about how things worked out, the flooding didn't impair the system for more than 3 or 4 days. Well, it's still impaired in some places. It didn't shut it down for more than 3 or 4 days. We can't count on that combination of things happening in the future. We really came very close to losing the subway for months. So the city and the state are not standing still in the face of the risk. They are doing some things. And this is a comprehensive plan. You could find it on the web. It's the SIR report. And they're planning things for anywhere from the sort of natural defenses. Don't even try. There's no point. Just show this for distraction. The natural defenses that Guy talked about, which is like the stuff going on around Jamaica Bay and sort of modest hardware things Like, I think the blue things over there at the end of the Rockaways involve building artificial reefs, as I recall, but also some bigger projects, storm barriers, which can be moved into place when necessary, and a few permanent ones, including one down near South Street Seaport that would involve an immense real estate development if it ever happened, and a sop to the real estate industry in the city. And the question is, how much of this will ever get done? One of the interesting, by the way, this is another example in the report. One of the things that happened in Sandy with the hospitals, as you know, several hospitals, particularly on the east side, the NYU hospitals, were shut down. Patients had to be carried out. It was because of, mistakes, we'll call them, or informed mistakes. That is, people knew this could happen. They didn't do anything about it. Of the emergency generating systems being below street level. This is the kind of thing that happens in cities because land is valuable. And we saw the same thing if you live down here with the Con Ed substation going out. Good, I'm on time. So one point is things that you think could happen, but you think are unlikely, they're coming more likely in the future. I'm sure the people who put the generators, the emergency systems in the basements knew if a flood was high enough, it could go out. They just counted it as unlikely. Once in 100 years, so what? But if you build a building now, it has to be good for a flood that could happen once every 10 years, once every 5 years. So that's lesson number one. And that's expensive to move that stuff out. There are now regulations in place, plans. We'll watch to see if it ever happens. Just to remind you of the political difficulty of all this, the plan says it has a rather interesting description of what the city should be doing with regard to protecting tunnels, like the subway tunnels. Department of Transportation has evaluated a series of potential flood protection measures, and it lists all these good things that can be done. The subway vent systems will be raised, or a new system will be developed so water just doesn't pour into the subways, for instance, et cetera, et cetera. But then, of course, the red, subject to available funding. And if you add up the cost, I mean, you have to put the kind of attention on this that was put on the third water tunnel, where you have an infrastructure project that you know you're not going to finish right away, and that there has to be attention paid and resources set to doing it over the course of many, many decades. And this is my favorite. The city then put out a second report. The de Blasio administration just put out a report about a week ago saying, and they had a list of progress that's been made in dealing with Sandy, and what they trumpeted was the renovations to the National Flood Insurance Program to protect New York residents from punishing rate increases. And while it's true, I think the program needed some correction because the rate increases came in too far, the glee was all relieving people of the responsibility for actually paying market rates so that behavior will change. And that's a problem. It's politically infeasible to really make people pay market rates for the insurance for having houses where they shouldn't be, or houses that are less resilient than they should be. We have to get out of that habit, or else we're not going to solve the problem. And this is my favorite picture. I show this again and again. Shows the example of policymakers not learning. There was a big storm in 1992. It's on that bar chart I showed you a while ago. In that storm, the city subway didn't get flooded, but the Hoboken subway did. It wasn't a hurricane. It was just a nor'easter. And this is the Hoboken station on the lower panel in 1992, but that's the Hoboken station during Hurricane Sandy at the top. Same photo, basically. Same place. Same thing happened. And the point here is that people who planned the transportation infrastructure knew this could happen. They started planning against this eventuality, and a couple of years later, they just quit because other things came in the way. It's that other stuff coming in the way that we have to fight against with this problem. Here are the reasons why it's so tough. Episodes like Sandy are infrequent. They're learnable, teachable moments, but they go away because memories are short. Planning times are long. This has to be done over decades. Nothing is finished fast. Risk is increasing continuously in the meantime, and all the political incentives are absolutely in the wrong direction for intelligent risk management. And finally, even if we don't get the big things done, even doing some of the little things pay. This is my favorite example of a poor country, not much resources, too many people living in a small space, very vulnerable to sea level rise. 1 million people used to die every time, when cyclones hit. I don't mean every time, but it happened in 1970. They started doing the simple things, early warning systems and concrete bunkers. Now the death rates, while not good, are down in the thousands instead of near 1 million. That's the kind of thing, those kind of low regret strategies that we need to start doing on an everyday basis. While we think about the big stuff, it is possible, particularly if the ice sheets are very vulnerable, we don't know, that at some time in the future we'll have to do what London did, or even build a hard wall, because if the ice sheets start to go, sea level eventually, over a few hundred years possibly, will go up 40 feet, not 4 feet, and then we'll be in big trouble. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Third, we have Jerold Kayden. He's an urban planner and lawyer, and the Frank Backus Williams Professor of Urban Planning and Design at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, where he previously served as co-chair of the Department of Urban Planning and Design. Jerold's teaching and scholarship address issues of land use and environmental law, public and private real estate development, the role of public space in cities, and the relationship between climate change and land development. His books include Privately Owned Public Space, The New York Experience, Landmark Justice, The Influence of William J. Brennan on America's Communities, and Zoning and the American Dream, and as well as Promises to Keep. Zoning and the American Dream, Promises to Keep is the subtitle. Is that true? Since 1991, he has served as Principal Constitutional Counsel of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. He has worked internationally on land reform and development in Ukraine, Armenia, Russia, China, Nepal, and Thailand for the World Bank, UNDP, and USAID, among other countries and donor organizations. His academic honors include a Guggenheim Fellowship. Please help me welcome Jerold Kayden.
Thank you very much. It's delightful to be here. And Michael, thanks for not making us scared and keeping us cautiously optimistic. So I'm going to talk about yet another challenge that we face with regard to particularly sea level rise in coastal areas. And the role of private property rights in the United States is on keen display when it comes to the issue of rebuilding in climate vulnerable coastal areas. Individuals and businesses located in these vulnerable areas are deeply invested emotionally as well as financially in their properties. They may have occupied their home or their business facility for decades, if not generations. Now, they and we are faced with a new and disquieting reality: flood conditions that trigger questions about how should owners continue to inhabit such areas, or indeed whether they should inhabit such areas at all. This is a legal issue. This is a political issue. At heart, it's really an ethical issue which captures all of that. It's worth noting, and Guy actually already referred to earthquake zones, that these issues are not uniquely applicable to the climate change, sea level rise, and flooding issue. There is tornado alley or alleys, hurricane-prone areas, earthquake zones, forest fire areas, landslide areas, and we read about this all of the time in the United States and from around the world. Yes, they have their different valences, but they present similar problems. And in all cases, there are, in particular, two distinct categories of affected populations. Those that have buildings on land, and within that category, some of the buildings are more personal than other buildings that might be business-oriented. And then there are those who have vacant land without buildings. As a matter of public policy, social attitudes, and individual behaviors, we're forced to ask a series of more precise questions. Should owners with existing structures be allowed to rebuild in place? Should owners with existing structures be allowed to rebuild in place only if they adhere to new costly standards, stilts, new dry and wet proofing, et cetera? Should owners with existing structures themselves be required to retrofit? Should government help owners to rebuild in place with subsidies? Should government offer compensation to encourage individuals to move? Should government prohibit individuals from rebuilding, but offer compensation? Should government prohibit individuals from rebuilding without compensation? Should we distinguish between homeowners and business owners? Should owners of vacant land be able to build? Should prospective owners be able to buy into a vulnerable area and then claim the right to build? The long-standing interplay between private property rights and government regulation provides some, although hardly total, illumination on this issue, but it's worth visiting for at least some knowledge and history. Private property, what is it? It is normally characterized as a series of rights or relationships to land, but lawyers like to talk about the right to use your property, the right to exclude others from your property, and the right to transfer your property by sale or lease or bequest or gift or some other transfer device. And these three rights together constitute one's right to full private property. Now, contrary to the claims of some, this right of private property is hardly absolute, and owners cannot do whatever they wish with their property. And indeed, for centuries, property owners have had to deal with the common law, the English common law, which then migrated to the United States, of nuisance. You probably know the common law of nuisance by its Latin phrase, sicuter tuo ut alienem non laetus. But in case you don't, what that actually means is that nuisance law prevents owners of private property from creating nuisances on their property that unreasonably interfere with the enjoyment of property by their neighbors. And there's a concept and a law of public in addition to private nuisance, which refers to the use of property that is harmful to society as a whole. So as harsh as it may sound, and it is harsh, one may ask whether building in harm's way may be understood as a nuisance type of land use. The owner says, I'm not asking for any help from government during or after future flooding events, so what's the nuisance? I should say some owners say that. But notwithstanding even these owners' claims of self-reliance, society steps in and will provide help with first responders and later with financial support for those harmed by flooding. That reflexive help may, in a way, be characterized as an imposition of sorts upon society, upon a humane society that will simply not stand by and allow owners to suffer the harm that results from future flooding. Well, we have evolved beyond simple nuisance law, and we now have the adjudication of private property rights and government regulation under the Constitution of the United States. We have many laws, legislatively enacted laws, like zoning and environmental laws, that regularly restrict, as we know, the use of property in order to promote the police power quartet, is what it's called, of health, safety, morals is thrown in there, and general welfare. Indeed, protecting the health of individuals with regard to, among other things, use of land, is at the heart of many of our laws, even if those individuals would say that they don't want to be helped. Now, in balancing private property rights and government regulation, and after all, government regulation may infringe or restrict the exercise of private property rights, the United States is guided by the Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution, which has the so-called takings or just compensation clause. And that clause says, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. And it has been interpreted to apply to laws like zoning and other controls that are increasingly in play when we deal with the effects of climate change, sea level rise, and coastal vulnerabilities. The takings clause at heart is a clause of fundamental fairness. The Supreme Court has told us that it's designed to ensure that individuals, in this case private property owners, do not bear burdens that in all fairness and justice should be borne by society as a whole. So at heart, the question here is who should bear the costs associated with a coastal location and anticipated future increased flooding? Should it be the individual owner? Should it be society as a whole? Or should it be some shared enterprise? Now, over 20 years ago, the United States Supreme Court directly addressed this issue in a case that was famous at the time and actually will become known once more as we continue to have more and more of these conflicts. It's the Lucas versus South Carolina Coastal Council case decided in 1992. Let me tell you the facts of that case. In 1986, David Lucas purchased 2 parcels, non-contiguous parcels, in an existing subdivision on the South Carolina coast, really on the beach of South Carolina, for $975,000, planning to build a home for himself on one of the lots and to sell the other lot speculatively to others. 2 years later, after he had purchased the lots, the South Carolina legislature enacted its Beachfront Management Act, whose purposes, and I'll read, were to, quote, protect life and property by serving as a storm barrier which dissipates wave energy and contributes to shoreline stability. Also, by the way, to protect flora and fauna and promote tourism, things that property owners love to hear about. The findings of the legislature included the following: that development on the beach has, quote, jeopardized the stability of the beach dune system, accelerated erosion, and endangered adjacent property. After the law was passed, a coastal council, the South Carolina Coastal Council, a state agency, was created, and it literally, pursuant to the law, drew a line in the sand. And unfortunately for David Lucas, of course, his 2 lots fell on the ocean side of the line rather than the inward side of the line. And what that meant effectively was that although he could build a deck and a walkway and bird watch and build a campfire and other kinds of uses on his property, he couldn't build 2 homes. And clearly those uses didn't come close to be worth $975,000. He conceded that the purposes of the Beachfront Management Act were fine, were in the public interest, but he nonetheless sued under the Just Compensation Clause. The state trial court found that David Lucas was left with 0 value of his property, a total economic wipeout, found a taking under the Just Compensation Clause, and awarded him over $1.2 million. The South Carolina Supreme Court reversed. It assumed that indeed there had been a 100% economic wipeout, but it was still not a taking because it said the act had prevented a use seriously harming the public. The United States Supreme Court finally got the case and reversed the South Carolina Supreme Court 5-4. Although interestingly, it did not at the end of the day find a taking. But it stated that a denial of all economically viable use of one's property will normally be a taking unless there are what it called background principles under state law, background property principles, and it even referred to background nuisance law principles that would have otherwise been capable of being applied to David Lucas's property, preventing him from doing what he wanted to do under existing state law. Forget the new law that had been enacted. That exception is what is going to be particularly interesting today and going further. That exception, and this is what the court said, the exception of property and nuisance law is really inhering, it said, in the title itself, in the restrictions that background principles of the state's law of property and nuisance already place upon land ownership. So if you already have within your state these sorts of rules that would stop you from building a house on the coast because under state law that would be deemed a nuisance, then you can't be heard to complain if a new state law comes along and prohibits the activity that you were already prevented from doing. That's a property rights foundation for justifying new regulation. It says you didn't have that property right to begin with, so you can't now be heard to complain if a new law comes along, an environmental law, a zoning law, a climate change law, and it prohibits the same sort of use that was already prohibited. Now, are planning and environmental regulators historically limited in definitions of what a nuisance is? In other words, can the idea of nuisance change? Well, the court actually endorsed evolution. It said that, quote, changed circumstances or new knowledge may make what was previously permissible no longer so. And we have examples of that under nuisance law across the country. So things can indeed change. Now, what happened in the Lucas case? It's instructive. The Supreme Court of the United States sent the case back to the South Carolina Supreme Court to determine whether or not there were these so-called background principles under state law of nuisance. And the court reviewed its law and said, no, there are no such principles in our state law. It thus declared that there had been a taking and sent the case back to the lower trial court for a determination of damages. The South Carolina Coastal Council, in the meantime, reached a settlement with David Lucas, paying him $425,000 for each lot, plus $725,000 in interest, attorney's fees, and court costs, for a total of $1.625 million. And then, owning the properties, as it now did, the South Carolina Coastal Council turned around and decided to sell the 2 lots to builders for construction of homes on the coast. Ownership, doesn't matter whether it's public or private. Ownership is the key word. So what does Lucas actually mean? It's good law today in terms of prohibiting building or rebuilding in vulnerable coastal areas. It means compensation will be required constitutionally unless there are these background principles or nuisance or property law. Now, there are other background principles beyond nuisance law. There is something called the public trust doctrine, most famously articulated in a Wisconsin case. It's a state law concept in general. And the Just versus Marinette County case has some interesting rhetoric. There, a shoreline zoning ordinance prevented landowners from placing landfill on their property, which was located along a lake. This stopped them from building and apparently denied them all economically viable use. Yet the Wisconsin court upheld that restriction. Listen to the rhetoric. Is the ownership of a parcel of land so absolute that man can change its nature to suit any of his purposes? Quote, an owner of land has no absolute and unlimited right to change the essential natural character of his land so as to use it for a purpose for which it was unsuited in its natural state and which injures the rights of others. And, quote, the changing of wetlands and swamps to the damage of the general public by upsetting the natural environment and the natural relationship is not a reasonable use of that land. So we will scurry as lawyers to explore what sort of background principles may exist state by state by state. So where does this leave us? Hopefully, first, I hope it does not leave us in court. And indeed, part of my talk is entitled The Ethics of Rebuilding. And I think an ethical approach is a higher level approach that incorporates law, incorporates policy, but begins to frame the issue in terms of behaviors. When we talk about that ethical behavior, sometimes we do actually talk about good and bad behavior on the parts of the 2 major players here, the property owner on the one hand, and society as a whole on the other. Obviously, this area is going to be fraught with disagreement, and the equities are pronounced on all sides. Owners who seek to rebuild in place without restriction, who seek public subsidies, or at least want to be compensated if they are prevented from rebuilding or building, make a sympathetic case. They live there and have for decades or generations. They have established a community there. There is a personal relationship to place. They bought their land years before there was an inkling of climate change-induced flooding. They have relied to some degree on the fact that they have been allowed to build and rebuild in the past. They have expectations to rebuild based on that past practice. And there is a nationwide compact that has, generally speaking, been observed in the United States to help people after disasters wherever they occurred. There, after all, but for the grace of God, go I. Over time, however, and it's starting to happen already, I suspect we will see the emergence of a counter-narrative that says there is at least some agency on the part of owners that should not be encouraged. Society should not promote or subsidize behavior that is harmful and costly to individuals and society. What economists and others sometimes call the moral hazard problem. Yes, there may be new rules, but things change. Science is telling us more about flood risks and sea level rise, and new rules are an appropriate response to such changes. We, after all, don't think anything about new rules requiring homeowners to install, after the fact, smoke detectors or carbon monoxide detectors in their houses, even though this may be a new requirement that did not exist at the time they bought their house. Now, we understand, of course, that one thing is relatively cheap and the other thing is wildly expensive. But is that the only distinction to be made? So today there are talks about buyouts at fair market value, about real estate tax breaks, and Michael already referenced the flood insurance subsidies for premiums. In 2012, 2 years ago, Congress, and signed by the President, enacted the Biggert-Waters Flood Insurance Reform Act, which actually attempted to reduce or eliminate subsidies for premiums for flood insurance that had been subsidizing the building in vulnerable areas. By the way, Biggert-Waters. You almost can't believe that that's the name of the act. Maxine Waters, by the way, not water. All right. Several weeks ago, on March 21st, 2014, President Obama signed the Homeowner Flood Insurance Affordability Act of 2014, repealing much of that attempt 2 years ago to remove the subsidies on that. This is a hot political issue, but tomorrow things will change, and we have to be fair about it. Transition protections that give individuals time to adjust. Careful attention to equity so that the burden does not fall on those least able to afford it. But the shibboleth of property rights, I suspect, will increasingly lose some of its power. The times, they are a-changing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jerold. Fascinating. Finally, I'd like to introduce Stephen Cohen, the Executive Director of Columbia University's Earth Institute and a professor in the practice of public affairs at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. He is also the director of the Masters of Public Administration program in Environmental Science and Policy at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs, and the director of the Masters of Science in Sustainability Management at Columbia University School of Continuing Education. From 2002 to 2006, he directed education programs at the Earth Institute. From 1998 to 2001, Cohen was Vice Dean of Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. From 1985 to 1998, he was Dean of the Faculty and Curriculum at SIPA. He's a graduate of James Madison High School in Brooklyn, so he's a local guy, and Franklin College of Indiana and State University of New York in Buffalo, MA, PhD. And Cohen was a Ford Foundation Fellow in Urban Environmental Policy in 1976-77. In 1978-79, he was a Rockefeller Foundation Fellow in Public Environmental Policy and Implementation. Welcome.
We've been talking a lot about adaptation to climate change, and I think that's important because there's no question it's happening and these effects are happening. But I think it would be better to avoid it if we could. And I think the fundamental issue for climate is that we have to make a transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy. So I'm going to talk about that challenge, the barriers to it, and some of the solutions. How do we get from the current way we approach energy to another way to approach energy? Because I think the heart of the climate problem is, of course, energy. In fact, energy is at the core of the sustainability challenge itself. Enough energy that doesn't destroy the planet, and you can do a lot of things to preserve the planet. If we solve the energy problem, we solve the sustainability problem. With a growing and glowing global population, increased energy use, energy demand has increased substantially. And I should say that, there's a lot of discussion about how we should reduce the use of energy here in the United States and in Europe. And I think to some degree that is something that's actually underway. But we are, in fact, very, very dependent on energy. And no matter what we do in this part of the world, China and India and their increased use of energy will dwarf whatever the West does. And so, in fact, if we're going to really mitigate climate change, we have to end our dependence on fossil fuels. Now, I'm not going to go through why that is. I think it's obvious. When you take this stuff out of the ground, it does bad things to the ecosystem. When you burn it, it does bad things to our lungs and to the planet. And these resources are finite. They will someday run out. They're also getting harder and harder to extract from the ground. And they have this problem. Once you get them out of the ground, you've got to ship them to where you need them. You might get rid of the Keystone Pipeline, but then they're going to haul it by train and truck, sometimes blowing up in towns. So this is a source of energy that we need to get away from, and the need is urgent. Renewable energy has the potential to transform the energy business, and in fact has the potential to transform this particular problem. We need to develop a form of energy that's cheaper, less capital intensive, more reliable, decentralized, all of these things. And I think that a lot of our focus in the world of climate policy has been on raising the price of fossil fuels through carbon tax and cap and trade and things of that sort. And I think we need to, it reminds me sometimes actually of the strategy of prohibition. Let's get rid of drugs by making them illegal. Let's get rid of alcohol by making it illegal. None of those things that we've been dependent on that we try to ban, none of those policies ever seem to work. And I think that what happens, or what could happen in the case of energy, is we do something that is so technologically superior that nobody wants to use the old stuff anymore. I mean, think about how many of you in your apartments or your dorm rooms or your friends have landlines for telephones. I mean, what happened? How did we end up all addicted to these things? In fact, all of these technologies are incredibly addictive. And the fact is that we've seen transformation of technology throughout the 20th century, and that really is part of what we have to try to accelerate here if we're going to solve the climate problem. No technological challenge is more important for the future of our civilization than getting off of fossil fuels and onto something else. Okay, this is really the heart of the issue. How do we make that transition? We've made technological transitions before. At the beginning of the 20th century, if you were in this part of Manhattan, one of the biggest problems we had was horse manure. We were knee-deep in it. How did that problem go away? Something called the internal combustion engine was invented. And suddenly we have other problems, but the horse manure problem is gone. So how do we make that same transition in energy? And it's really an important transition, but there are obviously barriers. The first, one of the barriers is folks like the Koch brothers and the entrenched interests in the fossil fuel industry. The U.S. energy system is characterized by large, capital-intensive, centralized facilities. It's kind of interesting because the rest of the industrial world is becoming networked and small scale, and you see all sorts of, an automobile. At the beginning of the in the early part of the 20th century, Ford manufactured its cars all in one place. Everything had to be assembled in one place. Now, the parts are made in 100 places. It's all shipped with barcodes and with containerized shipping all over the world to be sited in another place. But energy is still this early and mid-20th century technology. Old technology, highly centralized, and rapidly becoming vulnerable and threatening. We need to develop small, low-cost solar cells and batteries for storing the electricity. Now this, I'm a political scientist, so I can make this sound pretty simple. But in fact, the engineers and the scientists I talk to say that with enough R&D, with enough funding, with enough time, we could do those things. And the story I sometimes tell, and I probably tell this too much, when I was in graduate school in Buffalo in the 1970s, the computer I used was probably the size of this table. It was in a cold room with guys in white jackets. We had punch cards, and it had less computing power than this thing. So how did that happen? How did we get from that computer to this one? Well, there are a couple of things that happened. One of the things that was happening is we were shrinking computers to put them in missiles and to put them in rocket ships. And that was one part. And if you look at the development of technology over the course of the 20th century, two things you can often see. One is government R&D is part of it, and particularly in the first half of the 20th century, it happened to be military a lot of the time. And the second is that it was all energy dependent. Energy is everywhere. We use energy in just about everything we can think of. It is at the center of our existence, and moving off of it is going to be incredibly difficult. So that's a barrier. Most of the economic growth of the past 100 years directly resulted from technologies that were energy dependent. So we need something similar to happen for renewable energy, and that actually requires the government to do something. Again, one of the problems we have here in the United States is we've kind of given up on government. In 1980, Ronald Reagan defined the federal government as a problem, and now, 3 decades later, that's an accepted truism. Government can't seem to do anything right. Even those of us who would like to see government do right, look at the rollout of the Affordable Care Act and look at the website that the federal government put up, and you think, my God, a teenager could do a better job than these guys seem to be doing. What is the problem here? What's happened to the capacity of government? Just the same, though, if we don't have that large-scale development of R&D coming, with the funding coming out of the government, we are in deep trouble. So we need to figure out ways of making energy cheaper and make it more convenient. Today, if you want to make your home solar, first of all, if you're in an apartment in New York like I am, I don't have control of the roof, so I can't get up there and put up a solar array. So what if someday the solar array was the size of your window? And what if the battery that stored your energy was the size of your computer? And that was enough to run your house for the week? How many people would be disconnecting from the grid as fast as they could? Now, I say this and people say, well, that's really not possible. Well, why isn't it possible? And why isn't it possible for us to put the human ingenuity and brain power of our scientific community to work on building that one thing? No single technology would be more transformative to this country and to the rest of the world than that one. So you want to know, why aren't we doing it? So that's a barrier. Some other barriers is infrastructure is not set up for distributed generation, so you can't send your energy back very easily. I don't think I want to go into too much detail on that. Politics is really at the heart, and economic power at the heart of why we're not able to make this transition. Politics in the sense that as addicted as we are to energy, everybody thinks that, or not everybody, but the mainstream political view in the United States is that, drill baby drill. With enough of a focus on getting more and more fossil fuels out of the ground, we can lower prices and solve the problem. I know that's not the way people in New York or in Greenwich Village or in Morningside Heights think about it, but go to Indiana and go to Texas, and I guarantee you that's what they think the solution to the energy problem is. Now, the other factor about politics is that not in this country, but in the developing world, there is tremendous pressure for economic development. That pressure in places like China and in India and increasingly in other parts of the world is creating a pressure on the decision makers to build whatever kind of energy facilities they can get built with whatever fuel they can find. And in places like China and in places like India, that's frequently coal. So how do you get rid of that? No treaty is going to change it. No tax is going to change it. What's going to change it is a technology that drives those technologies out of the marketplace, a little bit like the internal combustion engine drove the horse out of the marketplace in Lower Manhattan. There is really no other answer. I mean, I'm a political scientist, and I look at political dynamics, and I look at what is likely to happen. And the pressure on the elite in the developing world to develop rapidly doesn't allow them to pay attention to anything related to carbon limitations. The only thing that is going to work is if they get a technology in their hands that is cheaper, more convenient, and faster to disseminate than centralized coal-fired and other fossil fuel electricity. This worldwide market for fossil fuels is exploding, and there's no sign of that ending. Now, the fossil fuel industry and their allies have a great concentration of economic and political power. We're seeing that in the U.S. in this midterm congressional campaign. They've waged a propaganda war against the renewable energy industry. They've diverted attention from the promise of renewables, questioning the science of climate, which, you know, I mean, I work at a university where, in the Earth, we have over 100 climate scientists. I've been to lots of presentations of climate science, and I'm not a physical scientist, I'm a political scientist. There's no question when you look at the data and you watch things like the IPCC reports over the time, and the idea that somebody could question this is beyond absurd. It's like questioning the existence of gravity. So the fact that they're able to even make that a serious part of the political dialogue tells you something about the economic and political power that the fossil fuel industry has in this country. So that's one side of the problem. The other side is that if we're going to develop a renewable energy industry, we need to drive capital toward it. The tax rules on renewables are unreliable. One year the wind power is deductible, there's tax credits, the next year there's not. You know, every state is different. The federal government can't decide what to do. And so that uncertainty works against the development of the industry. So I think what I'm going to do is conclude with what I think government has to do to solve the problem, and then I believe there's some time for discussion. First, we have to fund science. America has the best research universities in the world, starting with the land-grant colleges all the way through to the present time. It has been technology which transformed the American economy over and over and over again. And we need to have it happen again today. We have to use financial tools to steer investment. There's a variety of ways to push investment toward things that are socially desirable. If you don't think so, think about the fact that before World War II, most Americans rented their home. By the 1960s, most Americans owned their homes. That was because of public policy that deducted mortgage interest and property interest and the guaranteed mortgage backed up by quasi-government institutions. That was public policy moving finance in a particular direction. We can do it here. We have to invest in sustainability infrastructure. Some of it is the resiliency infrastructure you just heard about, but some of it is in things like smart grids, which would be really helpful, and in energy efficiency methods. We need to set and enforce regulations on energy efficiency and on pollution, some of which we are doing already. We also need to develop a set of sustainability metrics. I'm not going to go into detail on that except to say I'm a management professor, and you can't manage something if you can't measure it, because you can't tell whether it's getting better or worse. In the world of sustainability, every company, every organization has their own sets of measures. It's a little bit like the stock market was before the SEC came in. We have to do something on the sustainability space, but there's no time for me to talk about that today. We also need to figure out a way to get these transformative technologies, once they're developed, into the developing world. And in a funny kind of way, I again point to this thing as a model, because there are something like 6 billion cell phones in the world. The Earth Institute has projects in Africa, in villages that are not on the grid, but people there own cell phones, and they go to a place once a week to recharge them. So it's possible to get these transformative technologies around the world. We have to figure out a way to do that. And we have to stop this war between the government and the private sector that the right wing seems to keep pushing. Now, here's the bottom line. The war between the communists and the capitalists is over. The winner is both. You know, the Chinese seem to be among the better capitalists in the world, and we still seem to have developed in this country a mixed economy. Western Europe has a mixed economy. We need a partnership between the public and the private. That's the kind of thing that this country was built on. This city was built on. You know, 400,000 people in New York City live in public housing. The Erie Canal, had it not been built, New York City would never have been the commercial port it became. You look at this country over and over again, it's public investment and public-private partnership that built the wealth that we enjoy. We have to do that on renewable energy. If we don't revitalize ourselves and revitalize the way the government and the private sector work together, we will find ourselves under the 40 feet of water that we just heard about before. And it's unnecessary. We don't have to do it that way.